Okay, here we go. Okay, so what we need to do today is we need to pick up where we left off from Wednesday. So let's go ahead and do that now. Uh, okay, there we are. So we left off talking about id Software and PC gaming history. And we talked about the last thing we kind of left off with is the use of ray tracing in order to make the early 3D engines for the very first-person shooters run well. If you remember what that ray tracing is doing, it basically allows you to it makes sure that the computer is only drawing what the player can see. So if the player can't see it, the computer doesn't have to draw it, and therefore it can run much faster because it limits the processing that the computer has to do. So that's the importance of ray tracing. That's where we left off last week. Now we have Wolfenstein 3D and Doom, which were the first two first-person shooter games basically ever made. We had, if you remember from last week, some kind of prototypes, these early efforts. Now even go back a little bit, we had Hover Tank 3D, which is very primitive, and Catacomb 3D, which is starting to get us there with texture mapping. But really, Wolfenstein 3D was the first true FPS game, and it was actually based on a game that was previously released. It was almost, you might think of it as a licensed IP game, except instead of a movie or a TV show, it's actually an older game. In this case, the game called Castle Wolfenstein, which they really liked and thought would be a cool thing to sort of convert this game, which was a top-down game, an early 80s top-down game, into a first-person game. Now, I've referred to id Software as kind of like the Beatles before, right, to use a musical analogy. And the reason why I say that is because, the Beatles were kind of this band that for like 4 or 5 years or whatever were just like setting the world on fire. Like everything they were doing was like monumental. Like every album, the White Album, Rubber Soul, whatever it was, everything they were doing was like monumental. And that's kind of what id Software was like. When you had Commander Keen, the 2D game that kind of allowed console-style side-scrolling to happen on PC, but then you have, with the first-person shooter, an entirely new genre, basically, not even something where they are making something that was happening already in another format possible on PC. Here they're just creating a brand new style of game. So that's why I refer to them like as the Beatles, because just at this time period, everything they're doing is very powerful and very sort of influential and important. And part of that is, if you want to use this Beatles analogy and kind of take it to the extreme here, if you're familiar with the Beatles, you're sort of familiar with Lennon and McCartney, right? The kind of main songwriting team. Well, that's kind of the two Johns, John Romero, John Carmack. You have John Carmack making the amazing 3D graphics tech, but you have John Romero who had the design chops to use it well. And I think that's really important, because I think when people read about id Software, when they study that history, there is a bit of a tendency to sort of give the credit to John Carmack because he invents the tech, and we kind of have a technocentric view of things sometimes, where we're like, well, he's the one that actually made the graphics engine. But actually, without someone there that could extend off of that, right, know how to use it effectively, that it wouldn't even matter that he made this great technology. So they were working really well together. And an example of this is that the original Castle Wolfenstein had this gameplay where you would drag bodies around, right? You would, kill somebody, drag their body, loot them, whatever, because you were trying to escape Castle Wolfenstein, okay? John Romero understood that this gameplay, which they originally wanted to have in their version, would slow the game down. And he knew that the strength of this technology was how fast it was. So he excised everything from the game that was going to slow down the speed of the action. So that's something he understood very well. Okay, so Wolfenstein comes out, and again, it is a shareware game. Remember the shareware business model from before, where you give away a pretty significant portion of the game to get people to buy additional episodes later. Same thing with Doom. Doom is their next first-person shooter, and here's the thing about Doom that I have to really emphasize here. So Obviously, we look at this now, we look at this screenshot, and I guess it looks cool to you, but of course we have like so many more sophisticated 3D graphics techniques and all of that. But I will tell you, and I know it's hard to believe because you look at this and it looks maybe a little primitive. When Doom came out, what everyone thought, including myself when I encountered Doom, because again, I was kind of the perfect age for that, you really thought games could not look any better and be any more immersive than this. Obviously, that turned out to not to be true, but the reason we thought that wasn't necessarily because we looked at these graphics and were like, this is just the perfect photorealistic thing, because obviously it's not, but because it was such an amazing leap forward. And not just in the visuals, but again, in the speed of the visuals, because you did have games that used a first-person perspective kind of at or around this time or a little bit even before this time. And we're going to talk about some of those because they were typically RPG dungeon crawling games, right? Where you're kind of going through a dungeon. And the thing with those games is, yes, they had the first-person perspective, but they were slow, which works for that genre, but it was a completely different type of immersion to be barreling through these hallways, guns blazing. I mean, it was, incredible to experience it for the first time. Okay, so Doom did iterate on the technology of Wolfenstein 3D a bit, so we should talk about that. So we continued to have technical innovations. Now we can have texture map floors and ceilings, because if you look at the Wolfenstein 3D example, you can see the ceilings and floors are just plain gray, right? Now we can actually have texture maps on those as well. So that was a innovation. The other thing you might notice is that in Wolfenstein 3D, everything was a 90-degree angle, right? Everything had to be at 90-degree angles, so everything had to be very square. In Doom, you could have arbitrary angles, right? So not just 90-degree angles, and you can actually see that in the shape of the room there. However, it was at this point that the Beatles were beginning to break up. I guess if we really wanted to take this analogy as far as we can go, Doom's kind of like the White Album, all right, for id Software, in that it's a masterpiece, just a pinnacle of their art. But it happened right as they were starting to break apart a little bit here. And the first of the id Software innovators to leave was Tom Hall. And Tom Hall was really one of the creative minds behind Commander Keen, that sort of whimsical feel with the little kid in the football helmet and everything, and that kind of fits his personality. He's a whimsical kind of designer, and so these sort of dark, gothic, sci-fi horror imaginings just did not fit his own personal sensibility. The other thing that kind of pushed Tom Hall out is, he's definitely more of a narrative type person, and Commander Keen, for what it was, did have a narrative. And his original design document for Doom had tons and tons and tons of story stuff. And what ended up happening was sort of the same thing that happened with Wolfenstein 3D, where with Wolfenstein 3D, they wanted to remove everything out of the game that was extraneous, right? To just have this brutal, fast action. And with Doom, they did that even, it was even more apparent that that's what they wanted to do. So a lot of the things that Tom Hall was interested in as a designer, they just weren't interested in doing. So he left around this time. Okay, so when we talk about Doom, we also have to talk about the Deathmatch game mode. Okay, what's kind of funny about this is now, I mean, when you think about online multiplayer, in first-person shooters, we really do think of that as the bread and butter of that genre. It's kind of impossible to picture in our minds playing Call of Duty and have it only be single player these days, right? That's certainly true of any FPS that gets made. But it's important to remember that, again, one of the themes I always like to bring back in this class is, these are just assumptions we make because we're looking back retrospectively. So the Deathmatch was really a last-second addition into Doom. It was really kind of an afterthought. Now, to John Romero's credit, he recognized right away that they had hit upon something massive with this, but it wasn't something that they had carefully planned, at the beginning of development. I mean, they were really thinking about the single-player game primarily, because, Wolfenstein 3D was primarily a single-player game. So this kind of got implemented, near the end of development. But it became, this monstrous thing, right? Obviously, lots of people played the single-player campaign of Doom and liked it a lot, but even more people, as it turned out, really liked shooting their friends in the face. Imagine that, right? I mean, that's probably not terribly surprising. And the stories from that period of time, companies would just be shut down because there wasn't right away the ability to play people over the internet. The internet was around then, but it was a much different experience, the internet back then, than it is today. Much slower for one thing. So it would always be kind of networked, local networked environments. College campuses, another big area where Doom Deathmatch would happen due to computer labs and things like this. And so companies would have to put in rules to prevent people from, playing Doom like all day long, at the workplace, right? Very shortly after, though, Doom came out, they did figure out, even in those days, how to get it to work over the internet, even with dial-up modems and things like that. So that did happen fairly quickly after the release of Doom. Okay, so then the next step for id Software, kind of the next leap in technology, would be going from the Doom engine, all right, which is mostly just bitmaps, right? Mostly flat images. You look at these characters; these are all flat sprites. Okay, so now we're going from that to 3D polygons. Okay, so this was the next big leap, and we can see that actually pretty clearly just in these screenshots, right? If I go back, this is what Doom looks like, obviously, and now here is a screenshot from Quake. And so these real-time 3D polygonal, engines were starting to become a thing at this time. And John Romero actually was influenced by Virtua Fighter. Remember, we talked about that in the 32-bit lecture. So very much a situation where Romero, just like he always has, kind of was keeping an eye on what was happening in console gaming and really wanting the PC to, be more like that. And that's just another example here. Huge fan of Virtua Fighter. So he thought, yes, we absolutely have to have polygons for the smoothness of animation, for the ability to create a 3D space with more detail. And of course, John Carmack would then create an engine around polygons. Now, here is where kind of the final breakup of the Beatles happens here, right? We know that okay, Tom Hall left, but what if Lennon McCartney broke up, right? So this is where we're at here with this analogy. So what happened here is that the original vision for Quake that John Romero had was a vision more based on the RPGs that he loved. It was going to be something that would take place more in a Lovecraftian world with melee-based combat, and it was going to again be more RPG-like. But once again, just like with previous projects, they really wanted to focus on the action, so it became set in a sci-fi world, so we can use guns. And when you play the original Quake, you can see there's a little bit of that Lovecraftian fantasy DNA that's still there. Some of that survives just a little bit. But that was the original vision of Quake. And so now, just like Tom Hall left because his original vision for Doom was just ignored, now John Romero's vision for Quake was being ignored. Because we were sort of getting into a situation where, and I think weirdly emblematic, this is me inserting an opinion, okay? Just opinion time, warning. I do think in American video game development, we sort of let the technology wag the dog, the tail wags the dog a bit from a technological perspective. Whoever makes the things kind of decides the creative vision, not the creative people necessarily. And I think that was starting to happen here. And I guess what I mean by that is, no one wanted to do anything that would make things harder for John Carmack making this 3D engine for the first time. So anything that would make that difficult, it was just like, we don't want to do that. Let's just do the simplest thing we can do, which is an action game, okay? And John Romero's more kind of designer-focused, more complicated vision was kind of thrown into the trash. And you can debate whether or not that was wise. I mean, obviously Quake was a huge hit, but it might have been a more interesting game had they allowed for a little bit more of a complex vision. Who knows, right? Now, we're going to kind of wrap up the PC game lecture here. Yes, there's a lot more PC game history that happens after the late 90s, but we have to stop somewhere. But I just want to take a moment. First of all, let me kind of wrap up what ends up happening to id, right? Quake comes out. It is a big hit. I would say, in my opinion, it's not quite as impactful as Doom and Wolfenstein 3D, only because you had Epic Games was coming out with Unreal, the first Unreal, like Unreal 1, right? Like not just the engine, but the actual game Unreal. So they were competitors in that space at this point. You know, they weren't the only ones doing what they were doing. I mean, that's not to say Quake wasn't massively successful. It was, but I just, again, being alive at that time. By the way, quick anecdote about that. I remember downloading the first episode of Quake because I think it was also shareware. You know, it might have been the last game they ever did with that business model. And I remember logging into a BBS. Anyone ever hear of that? What a BBS is? Anyone know what a BBS is? That is called a bulletin board system. It was a very early internet thing where basically it's a server that someone has in their house or whatever, and you dial into it with a modem. And that server would have chat rooms, and more importantly for gamers, like games and files to download. And it's where a lot of shareware games were distributed. So it's sort of like, it's all text-based. You dial into the BBS, you get a bunch of text, welcome to blah, 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 right? And you type in text commands or whatever. I remember, uh, downloading the first episode, the shareware episode of Quake, at home when I was in high school, logging into some BBS. Though the web existed, but very primitive, so BBSs were still used. And I just remember having to let my computer sit all night, dialed into this computer from Texas. Sorry, mom and dad, for that long distance bill. Because remember back then you had to pay for that. That you actually got charged long distance fees. And that's how long it took for that first episode of Quake to download on like a 14.5 baud modem or whatever it was, 14.4, I think. All right, so yes, it would go on, but without John Romero, John Carmack, basically. And of course, they would make lots of games. I would argue that until recently, until, I would say 2016 Doom, I would say id without a creative force like John Romero, less cool. And again, personal opinion time here. I mean, yes, Rage is a cool game. Doom 3 with the flashlights, kind of a weird game, honestly. I think they kind of stumbled around a bit, even though they were successful, don't get me wrong. But it's just sad to me that great Lennon-McCartney team, that great team of the tech and the creative guy. By the way, John Romero's a great programmer, so don't mistake me saying he's the creative guy as someone that has no technical acumen. All right, that's not at all true. But it was just a good balance, and I think they maybe lost their balance. But now they're a totally different company now, right? id Software, John Carmack's not even really there anymore because of his involvement with Oculus and all that stuff. And so they're just a completely different company now. So let's take a moment and just talk about the legacy of id Software in the FPS now that we've gotten to this point. So first, obviously, this would affect pretty much every genre out there. Just even because of the use of 3D graphics, even if it's not in first person, just the leap in game environment rendering technology that was brought about by these games, hugely influential on everybody. Okay, the fact that there's a family tree that's immense that was a result of id Software's success and even affected my career. So when you talk about Warren Spector, which would be Deus Ex, games like that. That comes from Ion Storm, which was John Romero's next company, right? You have Raven Software, still exists in Madison. They're one of the many Call of Duty vassals now, but they were formed because they were licensing technology from id Software in the early '90s. They made a number of really good first-person games that were kind of first-person fantasy-based shooters like Hexen and Heretic using the Doom engine back then. And people that worked at Raven eventually became my bosses at Human Head because they left Raven to form Human Head, right? So, and Human Head made Prey, which was a 3D Realms, first-person shooter. The Call of Duty games, all id Tech, right? People don't know this, but the Call of Duty games are actually made they're made with old id Tech technology. They've grafted their own stuff on it, right? So they have like modern features. but they are very much at their core like id Tech around the Doom 3 era id Tech. They just keep improving it, internally. So the legacy of id Software is just, tremendous. And another thing that I have to really talk about here with this is that they really established the level designer role as a real job, right? So I'm very thankful to that. I mean, they specifically would go out and hire enthusiastic amateurs that would learn, people that learn to make levels for their games in their spare time. They would hire those people. Because when you have game environments in 3D like this, it just requires a lot more work and a lot more expertise and a lot more effort to make level design. Before id Software, before the first person shooter, level design was just kind of something other designers or even programmers just kind of did, right? Just as a side task. And so it's really id Software and the first person shooter making it its own job. It's kind of why I'm here talking to you now in a lot of ways. So I'm very thankful for that legacy, I think. Because remember, a big part of what John Romero did was make the first really good level design tools. It's something he doesn't get enough credit for, I think. He didn't make the game engine, but he made the tools, the level editing systems of all of those early engines. And so again, just really setting the pace for everything that would follow. So, just massively influential in any way you can think of. Okay, so that's it for that. We're going to get started with our last 20 minutes on this other big lecture that we'll finish up. Obviously, we're probably not going to get through all of this today. We're going to talk about something quite related to this, the history of the RPG. So let's go ahead and get started with that. And I know I'll need to give you the attendance word soon. I'm not going to forget. All right, so the mighty RPG. And you'll see a lot of interconnection here between the lecture I gave just now and this one. Okay, so why does this get its own lecture, right? As opposed to just being part of a bigger game industry lecture or game history lecture. It's because RPG mechanics are now pretty much omnipresent in everything, right? Everything's got RPG mechanics, it seems like. There's some kind of element of a persistent character, stats, inventory. It's so pervasive, that RPG influence. So even if you hate playing like JRPGs or something, you're still probably playing a game or will work on a game when you get in the industry that will have some semblance of this stuff. And a good example is the screenshot here. Anyone play Marvel Strike Force on their phone? Any Marvel Strike Force players in the room here? They make literally like hundreds of millions of dollars. It's insanity how much money they make. But none of you apparently have given them a cent. That's impressive. Good job. Yes, amen. Sorry, that's another opinion. But look, I do respect a lot of the work they do. But yes, that is not my background either. But it's funny when I worked for Cold Iron, our parent company was Fox Next, and they are the ones that made Marvel Strike Force. It makes tons of money. What is Marvel Strike Force? It's basically if you took sort of Final Fantasy 7 through 10-esque turn-based combat and just stripped away all the world exploration and stuff. It's like only the combat, right? That's kind of what the gameplay of Marvel Strike Force is. So it's another example of just like RPGs cannot escape their influence. Okay, so we must all deal with these influences. So let's learn about the history of the genre. One of my favorite things about this slide is just the background images. Who can tell me what these RPGs are here? Yes. Brilliant. Yes, exactly right. Well done. Your name, by the way? Nicholas. Okay, right. So learning names, and because that'll help me remember your name, but you got that. Well done. So yeah, those are the two RPGs there. Eternal Sonata. It's like I'm just gonna briefly say what it's about because it's really cool. It's basically based on Frederick Chopin, the composer. He's on his deathbed and he's having a fever dream, and that fever dream is the game, right? It's really quite interesting. Okay. So RPG prehistory. We got to talk about this war game made by H.G. Wells. Yes, the writer, the World the World's H.G. Wells. That H.G. Wells, same person. So it's Little Wars. Okay, so he was influenced by Kriegspiel. He knew about it, and so he wanted to write, kind of a less serious, more fun sort of, version of Kriegspiel. And so that's what Little Wars is. It's a tabletop war game. And what's kind of cool about it is, unlike playing like Warhammer 40K, where you're like measuring something with a ruler and you're throwing dice to like figure out, you're actually using projectiles. You're actually like knocking down little toy soldiers with actual things that you throw at them and all of that. But it has rules. It's a rule book. And so Little Wars is one of the first war games that we see, which then influences in the 20th century all these tabletop war games that would come out from companies such as Avalon Hill. And that creates this community of war game enthusiasts, and that community includes Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. Okay, they were a big fan of these games, even created their own. And one of the things that Gary Gygax did is like, look, the 6-sided die not good enough. Let's try using a 20-sided die so we can have more randomness. But what he also did is he said, look, wargaming up until this point, sort of what you would do is you'd be like, I want to recreate the campaigns of Napoleon, or I want to do the Civil War, the American Civil War, or whatever. In other words, it was sort of about historical reenactment, right? What Gygax and Arneson did is, look, what if we took the statistical rigor of these war games that we like, but apply it to fantasy characters? And we're going to totally rip off Tolkien while we're doing this, and like not, and just slightly change the names of things, so because Tolkien was actually alive then, and so we don't get in trouble. That's the other element. So yeah, let's take a fantasy thing and apply this rigor that historical war games had. And so in the early version of Dungeons and Dragons, the dungeon master was called the referee, which is another thing they're taking from the war games, all right, is this idea of having someone, a neutral third party enforcing rules. Now, the early reviews of Dungeons and Dragons, when it came out to the wargaming community, there probably was some element of this is sacrilege. You're not supposed to be using goblins and orcs and things. It's supposed to be history. But besides that, there was also I don't know if this is going to work because requiring a referee, I don't know about that. And of course, now what's interesting is the Dungeon Master is such a critical component of this style of tabletop gaming. It actually is kind of what makes it interesting. Okay, so what was kind of cool about this is when you think about when D&D was developed, early 1970s, okay, it was at the same time, if you think about our PC game history lecture and we think about our early video game history lectures we've had, it was exactly the same time that we were starting to get enthusiast computer scientists developing games on mainframe computers at the university. And it just so happens, to no surprise maybe to anybody here, that the Venn diagram between early computer enthusiasts and like Tolkien fans, fantasy fans, and tabletop gaming fans, it's like two stacked circles, okay? Like basically all the people that were super interested in computers were also interested in war games and also interested in fantasy literature and all of that. So you had a Venn diagram. Sorry about the usual weird WebEx thing. You had the Venn diagram stacked on top of each other. So as a result of that, you had many early attempts to computerize D&D. Like pretty much almost immediately after D&D came out, everyone wanted to computerize it in some fashion. So that happened almost immediately. Now, the early text adventures that we talked about in the PC gaming lecture, that was one version of the attempt to computerize D&D, except they were really looking to computerize the narrative component, right? Not necessarily the dice throwing so much, the statistical grind, character sheets, all those things. They were looking to emulate the narrative aspect of D&D. However, kind of concurrently to that, some developers wanted to emulate the combat experience with the dice rolls and equipment and statistics. So that was kind of the other side that we're going to talk about now. So almost immediately after people started making games for computers, they started to try to make the CRPG, the computer RPG. Okay, so the first really important person we're going to talk about here is Richard Garriot, aka Lord British. And again, like so many things I'm talking about here, like he literally just calls this thing a Calibeth, which is a chapter in the Silmarillion by Tolkien. So he just like lifts that, and computer gaming was small enough that no one would notice or care. So anyway, okay, so Richard Garriot, he was a teenager in the 1970s, late 70s, early 80s, and he developed a early RPG called a Calibeth World of Doom. And this was a hobbyist project. He did this on the Apple II in the basic programming language, that is BASIC. Not that it's a basic language, but that was what the language was called. And he ended up, he was working at a computer store, and the owner of the computer store was like, "Hey, this is pretty cool. We should try to sell this." So he sends a copy to the California Pacific Computer Company. This is what computer game publishing was like back then, right? It was so kind of delightfully organic and small in so many ways. So it had a first-person perspective for dungeons and tabletop-style battles, and it was actually a big hit. He made 150,000 as a 19-year-old, which would be like you making 400,000 now. But honestly, I'd like to make 150,000 now. Right now, I'd be thrilled with that. Forget about the inflation thing. I'll take that. So anyway, this leads to the Ultima series, which is the first of our big three, right? There's really, when we're talking about computer RPGs, there's three series that were, kind of set the template for everything else, and Ultima is definitely one of those. So a Calibeth is kind of the prototype to Ultima, okay? So it's kind of beyond our scope to talk about every single Ultima game, but we'll highlight a little bit Ultima 4, Quest of the Avatar, because I think it's really interesting. Basically, what was happening here is that Richard Garriott was starting to get complaints from parents about the morality of these games, so he thought, fine, and I actually really love how he responded to this. He thought, okay, you're worried about like the fact that you can maybe steal things, or like you're just murdering these creatures or whatever. I'm going to make a game based on morals. I'm going to make it entirely based on this. Okay. In fact, Quest of the Avatar is based on 8 virtues, and you can do things like steal and cheat in various ways, but it'll actually impact you later in the game. So, in other words, this game had a very complex morality system. Okay, and what's also interesting is the approach to the protagonist here. The player was meant to really think of themselves as the avatar. I mean, the game was designed for this, that it was really you kind of transmitting yourself in the game. You weren't playing a fictional character, you were playing you, which, to my knowledge, is one of the first games to really try hard to do that, right? To really immerse you by kind of having you pretend that you literally were the avatar yourself. Okay, so Ultima gameplay, kind of getting down to the sort of brass tacks here. Now, you can follow the link on your own when you download this, when I get it up on the Brightspace. So the thing about Ultima is it features overhead exploration, right? You can see a screenshot here. You move your little avatar around, and this will look familiar to you if you played the original Final Fantasy games, and there'll be a reason for that that we'll get to, okay? And so talking is incredibly important, especially in Ultima 4. So what happens is you come up to an NPC and you actually have conversations and you type things in, and like they'll respond differently, and you actually have to coax information out of them. And if you don't, you like can't progress in the game. So actually, the conversation system is really important in Ultima 4. And NPCs ask questions and will know if you lie, and that will affect you later, because again, the virtue system of Ultima 4. Okay, so the next kind of in our big three here is the Wizardry series. Okay, so this is created by Andrew Greenberg, Robert Woodhead, and the company Surtech. Now, someone in here wrote about, for their game history paper, the Plato system, and they were very much influenced by the Plato system at the universities, which were, in the 1970s, like ridiculously, insanely advanced. So we're talking about 512 by 512 bitmap display. That was like crazy town, right? Like in terms of graphics capabilities for the 1970s. Audio, plasma screens, even modern networking. So Greenberg and Woodhead came from that kind of university-based Plato system tradition. One of the things that's interesting about the Wizardry series, which matters a whole lot, I think, actually, is they would be localized by Japan, by this corporation here in this very austere, kind of brutalist-looking building, the ASCII Corporation. And they would become very, very popular in Japan, which would be very influential in Japanese RPG development. In fact, there's Wizardry games, recent ones on Steam, that are basically made for a Japanese audience now. So that's kind of interesting to me. Wizardry starts out as a Western RPG and is now almost more known as a Japanese RPG today. It's kind of an interesting nuance. Okay, so the Wizardry gameplay, that's important. So remember, if Ultima, it's kind of a top-down exploration. That's kind of what I want you to remember about Ultima, top-down exploration. What I want you to remember about Wizardry is this combat system, okay? This turn-based UI, user interface-driven combat system where you have a character portrait there. It looks like a ninja-looking fellow. You have these options: fight, parry, run, take back, all right? And again, if you've played the early Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest games, you will recognize this format, okay? So this is really what Wizardry helped pioneer, this kind of style of combat. Combat in Ultima works totally differently than this, right? So this is the way combat worked in Wizardry, this sort of, again, turn-based, select an option, right? That's the style, okay? Okay, so the third of our founding fathers of the computer RPG, if you will, is this game here, Might and Magic, in that series. And in this particular game, the first game, The Secret of the Inner Sanctum, developed by John Van Caneghem in 1986 for the Apple II. This was one of the first computer RPGs to have detailed graphics, both interior and exterior. Before then, it was sort of, you got one or the other, right? You had Wizardry, which was much more about dungeon crawling, or you had Ultima, which is much more about outdoor exploration. Might and Magic, you had both. You had the indoor and the outdoor as well. These games were extremely open-ended, and one of the challenges is just figuring out what the heck to do, especially the early Might and Magic games. Heavy simulation sort of emphasis, and when you think about games like the Elder Scrolls series, even maybe some of BioWare's work, I can't help but to feel like they were influenced by Might and Magic in this regard. Characters age, they can even die of old age, right, during the gameplay. So there is a heavy sim element here. And if you remember our talk from our game design fundamentals talk, the difference between a simulation and a game, right? A simulation is trying to reflect reality directly, whereas a game is trying to be more stylized. Here, it's pulling more from the sim area in some ways. And oh, by the way, another thing about these games is they expected you to make your own maps. You got no maps, at least in the early ones, right? So when you're crawling around in a dungeon, you would actually have to get out graph paper and make your own maps, right? Unlike sort of games like Etrian Odyssey, which has a map-making tool that they give you if you played those games on the 2DS, 3DS systems. All right, so probably the critical peak of Might and Magic would be 1998's Might and Magic 6. And I mention this here because it's kind of interesting. We see this renaissance of the CRPG in the late 1990s. And it's important to point out because the first-person shooter that I just got done talking about just came in the early to mid-90s and just dominated everything. Just like, that was the only thing that mattered on the PC. Fortunately, in the late 90s, the RPG sort of saw a comeback, right? So you had a lot of really good RPGs coming out at this time, and Might and Magic 6 is one of them. You also had the Elder Scrolls 2 Daggerfall, which is a precursor to Morrowind, Oblivion, Skyrim, those games. And you had BioWare's Baldur's Gate, which would eventually lead to all of their stuff. Okay, so this was a really good time, and you can see some of the advances in graphics and so on. Okay, we have just barely enough time for me to talk a little bit about this because there's an important linkage I really have to make here. Console RPGs. Okay, so the story of Enix and Square. Okay, Enix. This only happens in Japan, by the way. I don't think this ever happens in America. This bizarre thing where Enix was a real estate company, real estate brokerage company, okay? And they decided, let's start making video games. I guarantee you that has not happened here in this country. where like you go to some realtor's office and you're like, let's make video games. They'd be like, you're insane. But that's what happens, right? And I don't know exactly why, but that's sort of just, you see this, I think, a couple different times in the early history of Japanese video game development. And so anyway, this fellow here, Yuji Horii, he wins a programming contest that Enix has. Oh, here's the word, by the way, because we are at 319. The word is hit points. Hit points. Hit points is the word, the attendance word, or words, I guess. Hit points, okay? So let me just make this last point, and we'll wrap up. Okay, so Enix, they give him this award, and because he wins this award, they send him to Applefest '83 in San Francisco. There he plays Wizardry, and he's blown away by it. He's like, I want to make RPGs now, but I want to make sure they'll sell on console. I want to make sure they have a wide audience. And he had the right idea of how to get that wide audience, how to take something that was popular with sort of PC gamers and make it work on a console. He combined, and here's the big important part, we're going to totally test you on this. This will totally be on a test. He combined the combat, the turn-based combat of Wizardry, and the Ultima 4 overworld stuff. He combined those into one game, and we can see that in Dragon Warrior on the NES. You can see we can see that the Ultima style is preserved of outdoor exploration with the combat style of Wizardry, and that's exactly how we got the early JRPGs. Okay, we'll hold it there. We'll come back to this on Wednesday. Yeah, I'll be around a little bit. Yeah.
So I'm gonna get the student started on